حي على الفلاح.
Umar Mukhtar, rahmatullah alayhi, was a lion of the desert, Asad al-Sahra. And the reason why he has that name, Asad al-Sahra, is because Umar Mukhtar, once he was on a journey through the desert, and what the people would do is that when they would take their animals with them, they would take an aging or an ailing camel with them, because they're likely to encounter lions en route. And when Umar Mukhtar came to her that this is what these people are doing, his traveling companions, he stopped them and he said that we're not going to do that. We will fight off the lion ourselves if the lion comes to attack us, and not just leave the camel, as prey for the lion. The lion did come to attack them, which he then shoots, became known as Asad al-Sahra, as a lion of the desert, because of this incident that took place en route to Sudan. Umar al-Mukhtar, rahmatullah alayhi, was somebody born in 1858, living in Libya at a time of real change, political change, social, economic change, that would have lasting consequences until our very day today. And those were the consequences that were felt across the Ummah, not just in Libya, but in fact in the entire Ummah, as a consequence of the fall of the last Uthmani Khilafah and the emergence of independent powers, the creation of nation states and nationalism and colonization and invasion of Muslim lands. Umar al-Mukhtar, rahmatullah alayhi, who lived really in poverty, he was someone who really appreciated what does it mean to try and put ideals of frugality over and above ideals of greed. And of course, he wasn't in a situation even to be greedy, because he and his tribesmen, his people, lived in that collective state of poverty, of having less, in life. He develops this great, amazing, capacity to understand suffering, to understand the needs of poor people, to understand the needs of a society that soon enough will become ravaged by Italian occupation. And so with the passing of Umar al-Mukhtar's father, he leaves this instruction for a very important sheikh, from his tribesmen, from his people, who was known for his knowledge, known for his wisdom, and then he wanted him to really raise and mentor and teach Umar al-Mukhtar in his early years. But one of the key things in Umar al-Mukhtar's early life, having to deal with the invasion of his country, was that he develops a very strong state of spirituality. He would spend a lot of his time reciting Qur'an, and so he was someone who was respected in his time, someone who would manage the affairs of the people, as someone who would solve disputes amongst people. He was someone who was known to bring people together, those who had marital disputes, those who had tribal differences that might lead then to antagonism and differences and fights. Umar al-Mukhtar was someone who would bring those people together. He was a people's person. He lived amongst the people, and he really exhibited and exemplified a very profound Islamic character, a very profound Islamic presence about him, rahmatullah alayh. Umar al-Mukhtar's world was changing around him. He'd reached the age of 53. What had happened is that the weakening, the disintegration really of the Uthmani Khilafah was felt across the Muslim world, but also felt in Libya. And what this did is it gave rise to Western nations to really take apart, or each one take, from the Muslim states that made up the Uthmani Khilafah, including, of course, Libya. And so Western nations, UK and France and Italy, all sought to, Belgium of course, to take part of that Muslim world, for their own advantage, seeing of course that it's now a dying empire. And so the Italians really had Libya in their mind, they had Eritrea in their mind, they had Somalia, Ethiopia. Even before the military invasion of Libya, the power of Benito Mussolini, that fascist dictator in Italy, had secured the forced emigration of Italians to live in Libya, to settle in within the country of Libya. And this is even before the mass military campaigns that took place in Libya. But they prepared the ground for that invasion. And so Umar Mukhtar, really in his age, his time, is seeing these drastic changes taking place, that loss of that Islamic empire, weak as it was, of course, but still that symbolic presence was now being lost and was being felt. By his time in 1911, the occupation of Libya began. One of the first things that Umar Mukhtar does when he hears of the invasion of the Libyans and their occupation is that he travels to a place called Zawiyat al-Qusur. This was a big grounding for the Sanusi, and Umar Mukhtar, of course, was one of them. And so he travels to Zawiyat al-Qusur to seek consultation from his people. He gathers his tribesmen together. And Umar Mukhtar always had a force, a very loyal force of between 1,000 to 3,000 people who would fight, against the Italians. And he goes there for that purpose. That was his first step. It was to rally the people together, those who were known to him, and think deeply about how do we deal with this occupation and invasion of our country by the Italians. The next big step for Umar al-Mukhtar, in fact, was then to travel to Egypt. And that was for the purpose because of the sheikh, the scholar that he followed and he belonged to and that was well respected, Sheikh Idrisi, was in fact in Egypt. And he wanted to go to him, to consult with him, and to lay out for him in Umar al-Mukhtar's mind the grand plan that he had about how they would resist this occupation militarily through negotiations if it was possible. The first step, of course, was a military engagement because there wasn't any talk of diplomacy at that time. Now remember that the numbers of Mussolini troops coming into Libya were 100,000, and this included infantry, and it included two types of cavalry: a mobile cavalry of trucks and jeeps and tanks, and also a cavalry of horses because of the terrain that they were going to be faced with. Umar al-Mukhtar's forces had quite simple weapons, but they had, in any case, nonetheless, they had that zeal and enthusiasm and wanting to do that for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so he goes to Egypt, seeks advice from Sheikh Idris, and then he comes back and he's rallying his troops around him. And then there was some very early engagements. One of the early ones was the one called the Battle of Bi'r al-Ghabi. And Bi'r al-Ghabi was one of the first steps for Umar al-Mukhtar, really to show the fact that these people were advanced and they had knowledge of how to fight. And that's something, of course, to Umar al-Mukhtar's advantage, and that's something that's pointed out, that he knew his own terrain, and he and his people were experts in guerrilla warfare. The Italians were not. And so Umar al-Mukhtar could just run rings around them. In the Battle of Bi'r al-Ghabi, so you had this convoy of armed vehicles coming to find him. And by the way, even when he was in Egypt, there were Libyan informants who were informing the Italians. And so Umar al-Mukhtar, therefore, surrounded by people, most of whom were loyalists, but also those who were informants of their paymasters, the Italian colonizers. And so Bi'r al-Ghabi, therefore, was one of the first steps. The other big one, even bigger than Bi'r al-Ghabi, was the Battle of Al-Rahiba. Was an amazing campaign launched by Umar Mukhtar, where they were able to kill 320 Italian officers and soldiers in that campaign. And again, it was a very big warning, in a signal for the Italians that this is a man who means business and that he's not going to give up easily. The third one was the Battle of al-Shafatir, which in fact was a retaliation unto Umar Mukhtar because of the great losses that the Italians faced in the Battle of Al-Rahiba. There would be many campaigns that would follow. In fact, Umar Mukhtar there would be more than 200 campaigns Umar could have in a single year, in fact, against the Italians. And so some of them are smaller skirmishes, others are bigger ones. But it's a continuous effort that he's engaged in. What it's led to was a bit of a crisis really in Rome, because people are really confused about why wasn't the colonization as easy as we expected. And so on the one hand, you have people who are leaving their positions in government in Rome, but you also had new appointments in Rome. And one of those new appointments was a man called Marshal Badoglio, who was going to become very influential as the ruler of Tripoli and of Al-Barqa. Marshal Badoglio was someone who really had Umar Mukhtar in his mind, in his eye, thinking how we're going to deal with this person. And so what he does, therefore, is that he musters a very strong force and thinks, how could we develop some of the strategies that Umar Mukhtar is using against us? Marshal Badoglio, before in fact he engages with him militarily, is that he thinks about some ways of coming to a diplomatic table with Umar Mukhtar. And what he wants, though, however, is that he wants a minimalizing of religious influence in Libya. He doesn't want all these Qur'an schools and all these Islamic madrasas popping up all over Libya. He wants a minimalizing of religion, and he believes that if they could control the religious sentiments of the people, then they would have control over the ideology and the minds and the hearts of the Libyan people. He wants half of the weapons of the people who are resisting, and of course he's promising rewards for people if they did that. In fact, he even launches a campaign of sending in aircrafts to drop leaflets over the major towns and villages of Libya, giving them that information that if they resist, then there's going to be great punishments, and if they stop resisting, then they would have rewards of money and rewards of shelter. And Umar Mukhtar, on a very personal level, was always promised these privileges, that if he just stops his resistance, then he would have an amazing life, remaining part of his life, with great privileges of money and property and so on and so forth. He would refuse that. He would refuse that. He's not doing this for the sake of the dunya. This is for Allah, for akhirah, to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and of course to defend his people. What Umar Mukhtar does is that he indicates to Badoglio conditions. And what these conditions were that came from Umar Mukhtar to Marshal Badoglio was that there needs to be, number one, an understanding that this is an Islamic Muslim country. Number two, that there has to be equal rights that belong to both Italians and to Libyans. There can't be privileges given to the Italians at the expense of the Libyans, that there has to be equal treatment for all people. Number three, the Qur'an schools remain. Number four, there has to be a returning of the property that was stolen. That property has to be given back to the Libyan people. That if these things are secured, then we can talk at the table of negotiations. Initially, in fact, they were accepted by Marshal Badoglio, but then immediately, almost after an acceptance, they were broken. And with more forcefulness, the campaign of Italians continues. It continues until even Marshal Badoglio then is replaced, and then you have Adolfo Graziani, who becomes the ruler of Barqa. And this man was very virulent, was very hostile against Islam, completely wants to shut down and a ban on Muslims. In fact, having access to any religious schools or Qur'an schools that Umar Mukhtar was involved in for all of his life, subhanallah. And then there comes a very strong campaign, a very brutal campaign of occupation from the Italians at the head of Graziani. And remember, the focus of this is in the Jabal al-Akhdar area, the region which is northeast of Libya, the part that's bordering Egypt. What they do is that they cut off the supply of the people of Jabal al-Akhdar to the rest of just of Libya and also of Egypt. They're dying in great numbers, and this is a great zulm that the Italians, forced against, created for the Libyan people in those concentration camps. 80,000 people, loss of livestock, lack of access to family, lack of access to anybody, you just cut off. And it was a way, therefore, for the Italians to bring out Umar Mukhtar as a way of kind of bribing him to come out, to be captured and caught. Umar Mukhtar, of course, his campaigns would nonetheless continue. But what had happened is that in the month of December, it was 1929, the right-hand man of Umar al-Mukhtar, Sheikh Fudail Abu Umar, was in a campaign launched by the Italians, and it was a big setback, in fact, for that Sanusi movement of resistance. Around the same time, Umar al-Mukhtar was nearly caught, and in a very famous scene, Adolfo Graziani finds his spectacles, picks up his spectacles, and said that today we found his spectacles, and tomorrow we will bring his head. And so Graziani realized that the game is coming close now. He's coming close to finally capturing Umar Mukhtar, who by this time now is beyond 70. Many things, of course, happened in the course of that 20 years of all those points of struggle with the Italians. One of the most beautiful points, I think, that's for us to take a lesson from, is at a time when once the Muslims, they capture some Italian prisoners, and some people from his army, they wanted to kill these Italian prisoners, and Umar Mukhtar said to them that we don't kill prisoners, and they said, yeah, but they do that to us. In fact, they do much worse to us. And Umar Mukhtar said to him, yeah, but they're not our teachers. Of course, he was looking at the great of him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he's our teacher. And so Umar Mukhtar by this time is grown old. October 1930 it was that Umar Mukhtar, in fact, what happened is that he was in the Jabal Akhdar region, and they came across a river which they couldn't cross. And so what they had to do was that they had to encamp in that region for a couple of nights. And usually Umar Mukhtar would take a large force with him in all of his journeys and all of his campaigns, but on that day he took a smaller force. It was a much smaller force. And so when they all came in their force, in their jeeps and in their trucks, with their weapons loaded, they spotted Umar al-Mukhtar rahmatullah alayh, and they immediately took aim and they shot. And when they shot his horse, they shot him, they shot his arm, and he was then captured. And it was a very, very big occasion. Umar al-Mukhtar was then taken to the port of Suez, and then by sea to Benghazi. Now, of course, there would be a mock trial charging him with crimes against the Italian government and Italian military. Graziani then writes about himself in his own book, and he says, that he meets him and he hands the glasses, his spectacles back to him, and he says to him that I knew that when I got hold of your spectacles, that I would soon enough, bring you to justice here today. And Mukhtar will keep saying to him that this isn't from you or from me, this is all the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Great reminder, and it's something that even Graziani respected him for, and one of the beautiful things that he wrote, in fact, about Umar al-Mukhtar is he said, Umar al-Mukhtar was a Muslim leader who believed in his cause. He had a great impact on his followers. They fight with sincerity and loyalty. And I say so because of my long experience in war. Umar al-Mukhtar was different from others with his strict religiousness. He is very attached to his religion and is merciful when victorious, Allahu Akbar. His sole offense was that he hated us and our policies. He never showed any weaknesses nor intended to sell out. He was firm to his principles, and that was why he was highly respected by us. despite some of his behavior against us, right? So it's an amazing testament, even from such a criminal as Adolfo Graziani, you know, of course, paying no attention to all of the crimes that he and his men committed against Umar Mukhtar and his Libyan people, but then just giving this sense of you know, credence, really, Umar Mukhtar and his ethics and principles. It was on Wednesday, 19th of September 1931, that Umar Mukhtar was brought out amongst the people, you know, to be executed by hanging. And what they did is, as a kind of a final insult, is that they compelled the Libyan people to come out of their homes to watch that spectacle by force. You know, 20,000 people were forced out to witness, and they also flew their planes, you know, in the sky to show that this is our power now and our strength over you. And on that day, in the morning, 9 o'clock in the morning, Umar Mukhtar, he returned back to his Lord subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah rewards Umar Mukhtar immensely, that Allah raises him amongst, you know, in the ranks of the shuhada, that Allah makes him always an inspiration for us in resisting tyranny and injustice, as someone who lives by the great principles and ethics of and value system of Islam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.